By the late 90s, the Resident Evil franchise had established itself as one of the key franchises in video gaming, and was in the process of infiltrating pop culture altogether. With a genre-defining original and superior sequel already under its belt, Resident Evil fans the world over were anticipating the next entry in the survival horror series. Excitement was at a particularly high level as a new console generation was just around the corner. However, Capcom's next installment, due to lots of behind-the-scenes goings-on, would eventually be released as a side story / spin-off to the series on a console that would unceremoniously be discontinued just over 12 months later. So with that, welcome to Fistful of Gamepad. I'm Rick, and this is a review of Resident Evil Code Veronica, the real Resident Evil 3. After the huge critical and commercial success of Resident Evil 2, as they did with the original, Capcom looked to port the game onto the Sega Saturn. Working with Nextech, who were responsible for porting Resident Evil 1 onto Sega's 32-bit console, this news was quickly picked up in many gaming magazines, most noticeably official Sega Saturn magazine, who were quick to start speculating that the Saturn version could take advantage of the 4MB RAM card, allowing for more rooms, more locations, having more enemies on the screen at once, and generally be an overall improvement over the PS1 original. However, it was quickly discovered that the Saturn's architecture was simply unable to handle the graphical demands of the game, and if it was even able to be ported over and get running, it would be a noticeably inferior port of the original. So, from this, Capcom and Nextech, still wanting to work with Sega, shifted their focus from Resident Evil 2 onto a new original title that was to be released on Sega's upcoming new console, the Dreamcast. Development began in February 1998, with Capcom Production Studio 4, Nextech and Sega all working together on the project. The game was officially announced in October 1998 at the Sega New Challenge Conference 2, with a proposed Japanese release date of April 1999. This was later pushed back to February 2000. A playable version was then shown at the Tokyo Game Show in the September of 1999. At the time, Code Veronica was one of numerous Resident Evil spin-offs that Capcom had planned across various consoles. These included Code Veronica on the Dreamcast, Resident Evil 0 on the N64, and Resident Evil Survivor, Resident Evil 1.9, as well as the next main numbered installment in the franchise, that being Resident Evil 3, all planned for the PS1. The plan for 1.9 was for it to be a game much smaller in scope and scale compared to previous entries, and featuring a completely new cast of characters, with a release scheduled for 1999, which would then be followed by Resident Evil 3, which would be the last Resident Evil game released for the PS1, as the existence of the PS2 was now very much common knowledge amongst the gaming masses. This version of Resident Evil 3 would feature Umbrella operative Hunk, who, following on from the fourth Survivor, is sent to retrieve a G-Virus sample from a cruise ship. One small snag, the cruise ship is now swarming with all kinds of the undead. However, this version of Resident Evil 3 never saw the light of day, as Sony announced their plan to release the PS2 in early 2000. This caused a bit of a headache at Capcom, as it meant that the Resident Evil PS1 swan song they had planned would end up getting released after the PS2 was released, which pretty much defeated the object. So Capcom opted to scrap the Hunk version of Resident Evil 3 and rebuild it from scratch on the PS2, which never ended up materialising, and the PS2 would go on to never having an exclusive numbered entry in the franchise. What it would get is a series of ports and spin-offs which, while trying new and innovative ideas, were not the next entry in the series that fans wanted. This led Capcom to finding themselves in a bit of a predicament, as moving the Resident Evil 3 Hunk version to the PS2, which we never got, really threw a bit of a spanner in the works regarding their initial release plan, as the initial release plan of Code Veronica on the Dreamcast, 0 on the N64, Survivor, the smaller in scope 1.9, and Resident Evil 3 featuring Hunk on PS1 suddenly became Code Veronica on the Dreamcast, 0 on the N64, Survivor and the smaller in scope 1.9 on PS1, and the new Resident Evil 3 now on the PS2. This meant that, at the time, the next main entries of the once PS1 exclusive franchise were now going to be on rival consoles, with the PS1 having to settle for scaled down spin-off entries. So, not wanting to sour relations between Sony and the millions of PS1 owners who have helped the franchise rack up sales of almost 11 million units at that point, Capcom decided to make the smaller Resident Evil 1.9 into Resident Evil 3. This decision, however, caused considerable upset with director Kazuhiro Aoyama, who now was faced with the pressure of turning his small, indie-esque Resident Evil title, which contained new characters and that you could possibly complete in one sitting, into the next fully fledged entry in the series that was going to continue the main story. Plus, the game he was following on from was Resident Evil 2, the best game in the series up until then, and arguably the best in the whole franchise, surpassed only by the remake. And I'll say it again, no, Resident Evil 4 is not the best game in the franchise. Plus, Resident Evil 2 sold nearly 5 million copies and was met with universal acclaim, so the pressure was really on Aoyama. The upset to turn 1.9 into 3 went so deep into Capcom's development team that producer and Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami apparently threatened to quit, as both he and Aoyama were so concerned that the game wouldn't meet expectations. So the question is, why not make the in-development and much more progressed Code Veronica Resident Evil 3? It follows on from 2, stars Claire Redfield, although it was initially meant to star Jill and have her fighting against Nazis, but that idea was scrapped. It wouldn't require as many changes as 1.9 would, and plus, the game further explores more about the history of Umbrella. Well, it transpires that the reason why Code Veronica wasn't named 3 is very simple. It was that Capcom didn't want to sour their relationship with Sony and the PS1 community. So things stayed as they were. 1.9 became 3, now starring Jill Valentine. PS1 owners got their numbered entry, which was a last Resident Evil hurrah for the aging PS1, and the world was introduced to Nemesis. The game was known as Biohazard 3 Last Escape in Japan, apparently keeping the original subtitle of 1.9. Us Dreamcast owners got our next-gen Resident Evil, which continued the mainline story, gave us some short-lived bragging rights,
smug mode,
and the hope that our little underdog of a console could survive. But it didn't.
Oh dear.
And Capcom got 2 games that sold 1.4 and 3.5 million copies on their initial release, along with future sales via numerous console ports. So everybody was happy in the end. Well, apart from us Dreamcast owners the following January. So, it's ultimately because of fan and customer loyalty on Capcom's part towards Sony and the PS1 owners that Code Veronica wasn't the next numbered entry. And, even though we know that Code Veronica is Resident Evil 3, I think we can forgive Capcom, because such customer and fan loyalty from a developer these days is quite a rare thing. I first became aware of Code Veronica while browsing through the January 1999 issue of Games Master magazine. This issue featured a reveal of Sega's new console, the Dreamcast, fresh from its Japanese launch. Also featured in the previews that month were upcoming Dreamcast games, such as Sonic Adventure, Virtua Fighter 3 TB, House of the Dead 2, and Power Stone. Also featured were previews of Final Fantasy VIII, Perfect Dark, Pokemon, Metal Gear Solid, Jet Force Gemini, Quake 3 Arena, and Silent Hill. But it was a small feature on page 27 that instantly grabbed my attention, consisting of 2 low-res screenshots clearly taken straight off a TV screen. This brief preview of the next game in the Resident Evil series was my first introduction to Code Veronica, and I was instantly sold on it based solely on these 2 screenshots. Fast forward 12 months, and with a year's worth of following Code Veronica's development under my belt, I now had a Dreamcast, and it was now just a case of waiting for its scheduled May release date. But the likes of DC UK and official Dreamcast magazine kept my hunger for the game very much fed. But it was the new technology called the Internet that really showcased what Code Veronica could deliver what we could expect, and how much of an evolutionary step forward the game would be compared to its predecessors. Websites like IGN, Games Radar, and GameSpot were able to showcase a plethora of images and, most importantly, actual running gameplay footage. By the turn of the millennium, where it turned out we hadn't all been nuked by the Millennium Bug, video game shows like Bad Influence and Games Master had sadly long since disappeared from our TV screens, thus culling our regular intake of video game footage, news and previews. There were a handful of odd video game shows here and there, but nothing to really write home about. Well, apart from possibly Cybernet. But overall, there wasn't anything on our screens that captured the gaming magic that Bad Influence and Games Master did. However, thanks to websites like IGN and a 56k dial-up modem, which meant that no one else in the house could use the phone when you were on the internet, you could view and download videos of upcoming video games to see what they look like. Now, granted, these were low-res videos of only 2 to 3 megabytes, but nonetheless, they were still able to show how much more advanced Code Veronica was going to be, although rather pixelated and small. For me personally, it was a trailer that IGN released that had me the most excited. This 2-minute, 5-second trailer that took me nearly an hour and about 8 attempts to download as the line kept dropping absolutely blew my mind the first time I watched it. The graphics were unlike anything I'd seen, not just in a Resident Evil game, but any other game before that. This trailer was exciting, graphically stunning, and the reveal of a certain long-time thought-dead character,
long time no sneak, Chris,
only sought to blow my mind more. Visually, the game was so advanced and detailed. It really was a showcase of the power of the Dreamcast, and a statement to all the naysayers who were writing the console off, saying it wouldn't last. Now, these people would turn out to be correct, as the Dreamcast was killed off by Sega in January the following year, a mere 8 months after Code Veronica's release, but at the time we still lived in hope. On its release in the UK in May 2000, where we had to wait an extra 3 months after the North American and Japanese releases,
Are you taking a piss?
it was met with critical acclaim across the board and hailed as the next-gen Resident Evil experience. At the time, my go-to gaming magazines were now Official Dreamcast Magazine and DC UK. Official Dreamcast Magazine, in their whopping 9-page review of the game, awarded it 9 out of 10, highlighting how the lack of a 60Hz option, slightly dodgy character animation, and its slowing down in places were the only reasons it wasn't awarded full marks. DC UK also awarded it 9 out of 10, referring to it as the most blood-curdlingly brilliant zombie em-up yet, with aspects such as the tank controls, which I never have had a problem with, in fact it's my preferred Resident Evil control style, door loading screens, and a lack of a 60Hz mode holding it back from receiving top marks. They even commented how the B-movie voice acting had been improved.
but I can take care of myself.
Today, Code Veronica on the Dreamcast holds a Metacritic score of a whopping 94. Set 3 months after the events of Resident Evil 2, Code Veronica follows Raccoon City survivor Claire Redfield, who, in her continuing search for her brother Chris, was caught trespassing in Umbrella's Paris facility. And after a lot of running, and despite a combination of some impressive stunt and gunplay that wouldn't look out of place in a John Woo film, along with some poorly placed flammable canisters, Claire finds herself knocked unconscious and shipped to Rockford Island, a prison complex owned by everyone's favourite shady bioweapons company, and wakes up in a dingy jail cell. While she's been incarcerated, the island has come under attack, which has caused the T-virus to be released, and soon enough the island is overrun with all sorts of the undead, both human and otherwise, as well as all the other biological nasties that Umbrella had been working on. In a quest to escape the island, Claire encounters 17-year-old prisoner Steve, I'm clearly based on Leonardo DiCaprio Burnside, as well as the very evil and rather strange Alfred and Alexia Ashford, the blonde twins whose goal is to try and do you a mischief while subjecting you to a plethora of puzzles to complete in order to proceed. Code Veronica continues the same style of gameplay as its predecessors. You explore areas to find items, be they keys, keycards or otherwise, to help you progress. Along the way, you'll also increase and upgrade your weapons arsenal to help you put down the putrid products of Umbrella. These range from old Resident Evil favourites like the handgun, shotgun, grenade launcher, crossbow and magnum, to new weapons like the assault rifle, and dual wieldable weapons like the machine guns and the M100P. Claire can also pick up a sniper rifle, and the side pack makes a welcome return to allow you to expand your inventory. You can also pick up upgrades to the handgun, similar to Resident Evil 2, and explosive bolts for the crossbow, which are a considerable upgrade to the standard ammo. There are also new ammo types for the grenade launcher in the form of BOW rounds, which come in very handy when fighting the Tyrant in the plane's cargo bay. As you proceed, you engage in the obligatory boss fights, of which some are more memorable than others, but overall there's a nice varied mix. These range from the snowy sniper-rifled skirmish with Nosferatu, to the claustrophobic clash in the cargo hold of the plane against the Tyrant, who I personally think was rather underused, to the Tremors-inspired worm battle, or the water-based Albinoid fight, where venturing into the water results in you getting electrocuted if you're not quick enough. All these lead up to the final battle with Alexia. Health is recovered as usual via herbs and first aid sprays, and you save your progress by the tried and tested ink ribbon typewriter combo. Controls are carried over from previous games, with the good old tank controls making another appearance. Now, as I mentioned in previous videos, having played Resident Evil since its 1996 debut, I was raised on tank controls. Some people are really not keen on them, and to be fair, I can see why. But for me, I love them. Even the remakes get the tank control treatment when I play them. However, one quibble I do have is the analog stick of the Dreamcast controller, which, let's be honest here, it's just a Saturn analog controller with 2 sockets in it for your VMU and your rumble pack. It's a controller that really doesn't lend itself well to tank controls, so I always opt to use the D-pad, which does the job just fine. The 180-degree quick turn that would also be used in Resident Evil 3 makes an appearance in Code Veronica, which comes in real handy when you're looking to make a quick getaway or dodge a load of the undead. Another inclusion are the explosive barrels, which come in very handy for clearing a random zombie gathering. Nice additions are the ability to use a herb you've just picked up, even if your inventory is already full, and pressing A, B, Y, X and start at the same time takes you back to the main menu. One issue I do have with the controls though is the switching of the run and inventory buttons. Having spent the past 2 games and countless hours on the PlayStation with circle as the inventory and square as run, imagine my confusion and later outright frustration that in Code Veronica, pressing B, which is where circle would have been on the PlayStation controller, which I would normally press to bring up my inventory, is now run. Similarly, pressing X on the Dreamcast controller, which is square on a PlayStation controller, now doesn't make me run, but brings up my inventory. Having that muscle memory from previous games completely switched made for some very confusing gameplay initially, and would land me in situations where I would find myself needing to make a quick getaway from a biological baddie, and pressing my go-to run button results less in me making a speedy getaway, more me inadvertently bringing up my inventory, thus giving the undead the time to get the drop on me and chow down on my jugular. Not even the options menu can resolve the issue, as there are only 3 preset control types, and none of them are the traditional PlayStation ones. One fantastic feature in Code Veronica is how it utilises the Dreamcast Visual Memory Unit, or VMU. Gone are the days of having to press the circle button, or X in Code Veronica's case, to see how much health you don't have. Now all you have to do is glance down at your VMU and your health is there to see. Code Veronica contains the usual puzzles that any Resident Evil fan would expect, but compared to previous games, the puzzles in Code Veronica were more time consuming and involved a fair bit of backtracking in some cases. New gameplay aspects that were introduced to mix things up a bit included having to deposit any metal items in a storage box to be able to proceed, which, having to willingly give up your weapons, even your trusty last resort knife, and proceed with no weapons at all, was a simple and clever way of creating tension. But overall, the puzzles are not hugely taxing, at least not if you're used to them. They're usually along the lines of find the jewel, emblem, or any item that can act as a key, or redistribute the oil pressure to be able to lower a bridge to continue. Nothing that's going to give you any major headaches. Some puzzles are taken straight from previous games, such as the painting puzzle where you have to press the buttons in the correct order. Difficulty wise, the game has just one default difficulty, although the Japanese version has 3 difficulty settings: very easy, easy and normal. Code Veronica is your typical Resident Evil game. There are limited herbs, ammo, and the game doesn't hold your hand. These can lead to you finding yourself in a situation where the character you were previously controlling still has an item that the character you're currently controlling needs. An example of this being the fire extinguisher. If you don't store it in the chest at the right time when you're playing as Claire, then when you take control of Chris later in the game, you're not able to extinguish a fire to get the Magnum. But you do have 2 chances to do this, so if you do cock it up, you've only yourself to blame for your lack of Magnum. As with all old school Resident Evil games, if you die, it's back to the typewriter of your last save, unless you're at the boss fight. Then you pick up just before the final encounter. As with previous Resident Evil games, you find and collect maps along the way to help you navigate round. And as the game was such a step up from previous games in size and scope, I did find myself getting lost in Code Veronica more than any other Resident Evil game when I first played it. The iconic loading doors are still present, much to DC UK's dislike, but I've always liked them, as I think they create a real sense of tension. There are also a few little Resident Evil based Easter eggs along the way too, such as the picture of Hunk and a hunter on the computer screen just before the last battle with Alexia. On its release, Code Veronica wasn't just the best looking Resident Evil game to date, it was one of the best looking games available on any system at that time. The game was a real technical showcase for the Dreamcast, and the developers used all the extra graphical horsepower of Sega's Little White Wonder to give us a truly next-gen Resident Evil experience. For me, the graphical detail at the time was mind-blowing. Right from the opening pre-rendered cinematic, which, although not as good as Resident Evil 2's,
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down!
was an amazing sight to behold at the time, and still looks awesome today. Most cutscenes in Code Veronica are in-engine and still look very impressive, keeping you immersed in the game and the story.
I can't get the door open!
The pixelated, blocky characters that we know and love from previous games were replaced with highly detailed ones whose mouths actually moved when they spoke and whose faces expressed emotion and even blinked. The pre-rendered backgrounds of previous games have been replaced with real-time 3D rendered ones. Now, don't get me wrong, I love pre-rendered backgrounds, but Code Veronica's use of real-time 3D rendered backgrounds allowed for the one static camera, which I also love, to now be free and follow you. This gives you the feeling that something is watching and tracking you, which adds to the atmosphere of the game, as the camera slowly tracks you as you walk down a dimly lit corridor or from behind a partition as you walk through a room. Another effective use of the camera is having it positioned behind a window, similar to Resident Evil 2. Viewing from this perspective, looking in at you as you search a room, really gives you an uneasy feeling of being watched. The freedom of the camera also allows it to fly and sweep over environments in real time, giving us stylistic tricks like the blatant recreating of bullet time from The Matrix when Steve bursts through the window to save Claire from a Bandersnatch. Again, the game really does remind you that it was released at the turn of the millennium. For me personally, there are 3 moments that really showcased how graphically advanced Code Veronica was at the time. Number 1, when the flaming zombie emerges from the wrecked truck and comes shambling towards you. Here you can see how all the flesh on his face and neck has been torn and shredded. This clip was used in the early promo footage for Code Veronica, and when I first saw that small MPEG, I was absolutely gobsmacked by how detailed it was. For me, it's still one of my all-time favourite Resident Evil moments. Number 2, when you first enter the barracks and the zombie in the foreground walks right in front of the camera. That level of perspective had never been seen in a Resident Evil game up until then. Again, the level of detail on the rotting flesh and the grimy clothes really made that zombie look like he was decomposing and putrid. And number 3, when you're walking through the sleeping quarters of the barracks and the camera is slowly panning down and tracking you as you make your way in between the rows of bunk beds. It really builds a sense of tension as Claire is turning her head from side to side to examine the beds, and you're just waiting for something to burst out and attack you. A special mention also has to go to when you're walking across the wooden enclosure to the private residence of the mansion, and the crashes of lightning are sending beams of light piercing through the windows. It's like something out of a classic gothic horror film. This gothic style that Code Veronica adopted would later be used in Resident Evil 4 and then most recently in Resident Evil 8. Speaking of lighting, its use in Code Veronica is another standout for me. From the moment you start the game, you're treated to some of the most amazing lighting effects. Claire's lighter creates an eerie glow as you're walking out of the jail cell and down the narrow tunnel. The light in the barracks which dimly highlights the walls and benches as it swings back and forth, or how the numerous things that are on fire create a soothing but unnerving glow to the surrounding area, including you as you walk by them. The glow on your character from the muzzle flash when you fire your weapon is a really nice touch, as is the glow from the goggles on the Special Forces zombies you encounter later in the game. Other nice little graphical touches include the water effects and when a zombie's hat falls off when you shoot him, or as they slump against the walls as they fall to the ground. Code Veronica, overall, is a dark game, with dark tones of greys and browns, and yes, while the game does look dated by today's standard, I'd still argue it looks good, and in my opinion, the Dreamcast version is the better looking version out of all the versions that came after it, even the HD remasters. However, despite the added power of Sega's little square-shaped stunner, giving us the best looking Resident Evil game at the time, as a Resident Evil game, it isn't actually that graphic or gory. In Code Veronica, we don't get any exploding zombie heads when you introduce them up close to your shotgun or magnum like in Resident Evil 1 and 2. Instead, we get random chunks flying away from the zombie's head, but their heads seem to remain intact. However, the chunks sliding down the walls are a nice effect. In Resident Evil 2, few things were as satisfying as kneecapping a zombie with your shotgun, leaving it crawling towards you on the ground. Or better still, with the upgraded shotgun, waiting for them to get close enough to blow their heads and arms clean off. In Code Veronica, nothing. In Resident Evil 2's A games, depending who you play as, either Chief Irons or Ben Bertolucci get ripped in half, courtesy of William Birkin's orally administered chestburster, which does give John Hurts a run for its money. No pun intended. In Claire's B game, Chief Irons ends up getting ripped in two in one of the game's best jump scares. In Code Veronica, none of the antagonists succumb to much of a terrible death. The Tyrant gets forced out of the plane's cargo hold courtesy of an ejected container. Nosferatu just collapses after taking sufficient sniper rifle shots to the sternum. Alfred Ashford gets shot by Steve after some rather limp acrobatics and dies outside Alexia's cryo chamber. Not exactly a memorable send-off for such a key character in the game. And similarly, Alexa, in her final bug form, simply explodes in a gooey mess when you shoot her with the linear launcher. I've always loved the use of sound in Resident Evil 1 and 2, as it creates a creepy sense of atmosphere, tension and fear within the game, and Code Veronica very much continues this. From the sound of the whirling wind and thunder rumbling in the background, which is occasionally broken up with crashes of lightning, giving the game a very gothic feel, which perfectly matches the aesthetic of the Ashford house. To the sound of the rain hammering down, which drowns out any sounds, this leaves you feeling really vulnerable as you're unaware if anything is just sat waiting, ready to leap out and attack you. The echoing sounds of your footsteps along narrow corridors or crunching along the gravel also adds to the tension. The sound of gunfire is also effective, as the booming sound of the shotgun and magnum sound powerful, as do Steve's machine guns. However, Claire's dual-wielded M100Ps do sound a bit limp. However, none of the guns on Code Veronica sound as powerful as the upgraded Remington shotgun from Resident Evil 2. As with previous games, the music in Code Veronica perfectly complements the atmosphere and mood of the game. While not having as much of a presence compared to Resident Evil 1 and 2, in that Code Veronica opts to rely on subtle sounds and sometimes outright silence to create atmosphere and tension, the music that is used is still effective, and for me personally, it's one of the more memorable Resident Evil scores. So much so, I had to pick up the vinyl from Laced Records when it was released. Particular highlights include the save room music, which, similar to that of 1 and 2, create a feeling of insecure safety and eerie calm. And while I do prefer the save room music in Resident Evil 1 and 2, 1's being my personal favourite, Code Veronica's still totally works. Other effective musical additions include the creepy lullaby that plays from the Ashford's music box, which is used numerous times throughout the game and also sung by Alexia. The voice acting in Code Veronica continues to improve on the campy B-movie standard set by Resident Evil 1.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
And the noticeably improved standard of Resident Evil 2. Claire's voice acting, provided by Canadian actress Alison Court, absolutely carries the game and is definitely the strongest out of all the cast. Court would go on to voice Claire another 4 times after Code Veronica, making her the voice of Claire in all but one of the games that Claire appears in, that being the Resident Evil 2 remake where Claire was voiced by Stephanie Panisello. The returning Albert Wesker, voiced by Robert Waugh, does a great job in giving everyone's favourite STARS traitor a quietly calm, calculated and menacing presence whenever he's on screen. Although there are a few stumbles along the way, which come courtesy of pantomime villain Alfred, whose attempts at menacing just come across as unintentionally comical and cringeworthy.
You must be one of Umbrella's lower level officers if you're in command of a backwater base like this one.
How dare you!
Other voice-based misfires include Chris's final speech about taking down Umbrella, which doesn't get you so much cheering as it does cringing.
Yeah, it's payback time. We've got to destroy Umbrella. Now, let's finish this once and for all.
And finally, Steve Burnside. Poor Steve. Our 17-year-old, arrogant, self-assured Rockford prisoner has so many cringy and awkward lines, it just makes you end up almost hating the poor guy.
It was dirty work, but this area is now clean.
And for me, that's one of the things that lets Code Veronica down a bit. It's Steve. He's supposed to be a tragic character, the personification and representation of the damage that the ruthless Umbrella Corporation inflicts. Steve's father was a former employee of Umbrella who was caught selling their secret information. He and Steve were imprisoned on Rockford Island, and just to further showcase Umbrella's ruthlessness, they had Steve's mother killed as further revenge. Heavy going for a 17-year-old. Naturally, Steve doesn't trust anyone, and initially is reluctant to team up with Claire.
I don't want you following me, lady. You'll only slow me down.
Shackled with a prison collar, which always reminded me of the collar from The Running Man. We, as an audience, are supposed to sympathise with Steve, as this young man has been through a mountain of trauma and hurt. But, due to some ropey dialogue and voice acting, Steve comes across like a petulant, arrogant 13-year-old, and it's very difficult to like him, let alone sympathise with him.
No way. He won't come.
You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
Even when he empties 2 clips worth of Uzi bullets into his zombified dad. The way it's acted, which admittedly did look pretty good in the trailer, in the actual game, it just ends up ruining any emotional impact the scene was intending to have. The same goes for Steve's death scene. This was supposed to be the tragic loss of the game, the emotional gut punch that makes you hate both Alexia Ashford and the Umbrella Corporation. We're meant to be devastated that we've lost this ally of Claire's, while also being shown the callous ruthlessness and overall evil of Alexia. But it was very hard to do this when we've just spent the past 10 hours seeing how unlikable and annoying he is.
This thing is too cool. Yes! Now this is my kind of weapon. All right!
Even having to rescue him when he tries to steal those gold Lugers.
I made it. That was too close. What took you so long?
This is further topped off by Steve announcing his love for Claire after knowing her for only a matter of hours. It's like a school kid with his first crush on his teacher.
I love you, Claire.
Having only lightly hinted at any kind of feelings for Claire in 3 previous occasions in the game, one where he tries to kiss her when she's asleep, which is just outright creepy, one where he catches her when they fall over, and one where he nearly completely scuppers their chances of escape altogether as he's too busy staring at her ass.
Steve, watch out!
It's toxic gas!
All these just result in Steve's death scene really falling flat for me, as the love story element, which was clearly shoehorned in, just doesn't work. Even when he actually does something useful and saves Claire from the Bandersnatch, his heroic efforts, where he does actually look quite cool with his double-handed Luger blasting Bandersnatch kicking single shot finishing off effort, is then ruined with
Oh yeah, that felt good. Don't worry, Claire. Your knight in shining armor is here.
Now, you could blame the writing or the voice acting from Bill Houston. Personally, I think Bill didn't have the best of lines to work with, and I think he does the best he can with the subpar dialogue he's given.
Ow! My back! You're heavier than you look.
Hopefully these aspects of Steve's character will be changed and rectified in the as yet unconfirmed but surely should be arriving sometime in the future Code Veronica remake.
Wait here, Claire! Time to test out my new toy!
Code Veronica includes a wide variety of enemies for you to stretch your trigger finger to and dispatch. Of course, it wouldn't be a Resident Evil game without everybody's favourite cognitively challenged enemy, the zombies. These range from prisoner zombies, to worker zombies, to extra rotten and nude zombies that emerge from the ground, soldier zombies, some of which have C4 strapped to the back which explode if you shoot them, so don't get too close. There's also a doctor zombie, a deranged medic who Alfred allowed to conduct sadistic experiments on the island's prisoners. The zombified dogs are back, but don't seem to have as much of a presence as they did in Resident Evil 1 and 2. I guess there's not much use for dogs on a remote military base. The hunters from Resident Evil 1 make a brief return, this time in 2 forms. The usual green hulking kind and a new toxic version, which, if it lands a hit on you, will leave you poisoned and frantically hunting for a blue herb. There are also proximity scanners, which slowly scan the area, and if you break their beam, an alarm sounds, and before you know it, you're besieged by a hunter. The huge mutated moths make a return to slow you down, lay eggs on your back, and generally be a huge annoyance. New enemies in Code Veronica include the Bandersnatch, a cut-down discount version of the Tyrant, with a powerful elongating arm which it can use to attack you from a distance or leap across rooms. Get too close and it'll grab you by the head and crush your skull. The Gulp Worm, the result of infecting an earthworm with the T-virus, which seems very much inspired by the graboids from Tremors or sandworms from Dune. These ginormous subterranean monsters glide under the surface and burst up to attack you, or in the case of Rodrigo, swallow him whole. There's the electricity emitting albinoid, a creature brought about by injecting the T-virus into a salamander, this enemy is encountered in two forms throughout the game, the larger form being the more dangerous. The T-078 Tyrant, which was created to train Umbrella Special Forces, is only very briefly encountered. The giant mutated form of Steve is only present momentarily, and you don't so much fight him as you do run away. The Nosferatu is a boss you encounter and have to keep your distance while taking him out with your sniper rifle. There are also other smaller enemies like plant tentacles which you encounter in the Antarctic base, as well as small ants and bats, but neither of these pose much of a threat. Resident Evil Code Veronica on the Dreamcast comes on 2 GD-ROMs and will take you about 11 to 12 hours to complete, which at the time made it the biggest Resident Evil game to date. Unfortunately, unlike its predecessor, there is only one main story campaign. There's no multiple character stories or A and B games here to add any longevity, but this is made up for with the overall length of the game. The single story of the main game does limit replay value compared to the likes of Resident Evil 2, where you essentially got 4 games. Load times are what you would expect, with the door loading screens taking the usual amount of time, and neither the pre-rendered or in-game cutscenes are overly long. On completing the game, you unlock the battle mode, a timed mini-game where you move from room to room, clearing out all the zombies and other nasties. Each of the controllable characters is equipped with a different set of weapons and items to mix things up a bit. This adds to the challenge and replay value as you look to beat your time and grade. You can play in either third or first person mode, which gives you a chance to get very up close and personal to the enemies. This also allows you to see the fantastic level of detail on show. Getting an A rank with every character will unlock the use of the linear launcher. However, getting an A grade involves completing the battle game within a certain time limit. But due to the PAL version running at 50Hz compared to the NTSC 60, this results in the characters moving slower. And as the game wasn't optimised during production to account for this, the time limits remaining the same, this results in it being more difficult to achieve an A rank in the battle game with Chris and the Another Claire character. While DLC was available for some Dreamcast games at the time, further demonstrating how ahead of its time the console was, unfortunately Code Veronica was not one of these games. However, it did receive an update in the form of Code Veronica X in 2001, which was a Japan-only release. This version could be seen as a revised and extended version of Code Veronica, as it includes roughly 10 minutes of extended cutscenes, one of which involves Wesker confronting Claire. There are also a few graphical tweaks, including items being more apparent, and the most noticeable, Steve getting a fringe, so he looks a bit less like Leonardo DiCaprio. But not much. Code Veronica X was also released on the PS2 in 2001 and then on the GameCube in 2003 in Japan and North America, with PAL regions receiving it in March 2004. But I still think the Dreamcast version is the best looking. It was then given the HD treatment and released on the Xbox 360 and PS3 in 2011, with versions being released on the PS4 and Xbox One in 2017 and 2019 respectively. While the game wasn't censored for things like graphic content, it was changed to eliminate any reference to the initially planned Nazi storyline. So, in the PAL version, Alfred's Tiger 1 tank was replaced with an M1 Abrams, but I guess you'd only really notice that if you know your tanks. Other universal aspects of censorship across all regions included the removal, no pun intended, of decapitations when a hunter leaps and lands a deadly swipe. And finally, the aforementioned exploding headshots, courtesy of the Magnum or up-close shotgun blast. All these censorship elements were carried over into Code Veronica X. For me personally, Resident Evil Code Veronica is a particularly special entry in my favourite gaming franchise. It was released at a time when gaming was changing and we were seeing huge leaps in graphics and storytelling. It was released on a console that had everything going against it. A console that was affected by poor previous managerial decisions,
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES. Yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Was released to a skeptical public and was always living on borrowed time. But Code Veronica showed the world the power of the Dreamcast and hopefully converted some of those skeptics. But despite the acclaim, I still feel that Code Veronica never got the love it deserved initially, much like the Dreamcast. Today, however, the Dreamcast is regarded with much more love and affection, finally getting the appreciation it deserved and not the scoffs it got back in the day as people waited for the release of the PS2. Code Veronica, however, doesn't seem to have had the same switch in opinion and never seems to get mentioned in the same breaths as Resident Evil 2 or 4. For whatever reason, I feel the game just doesn't seem to get the love it deserves. This is even reflected in Capcom's remakes, as so far we've had remakes of Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and 4 has just been released. But no Code Veronica. Yet. And that's a mighty shame, as people need to experience this entry in the series. This was the Resident Evil for the new millennium, a showcase of both the direction the story was heading in and the power of the Dreamcast. Hopefully, the remake will right the wrongs of the original, Steve.
Claire. Nice. I'll remember that.
And give us a modern day take on a much underappreciated classic. Personally, I'd much rather see a remake of Code Veronica than a remake of Resident Evil 4. But don't get me wrong, the Resident Evil 4 remake is fantastic.
Next.
Fans know that Code Veronica is the real Resident Evil 3. But as I mentioned before, I guess it's a testament to Capcom's focus at the time and the commitment to ensuring that the PS1 fanbase that the franchise was born on got its swan song in the form of Resident Evil 3. And I guess that's something we have to admire, because God knows we don't get that from developers today. And that just about brings us to the end in my review of Resident Evil Code Veronica. Please share your memories of Code Veronica in the comments below if you bought it on release, found it a few years later, or are just experiencing it now for the first time. And, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again.